In this unit, we're going to examine a different approach to crime. The theories that we're going to look at in this unit are from what's called the classical school or the economic school. And these are the ideas that came to dominate modern criminology. These are the ideas that undergird our contemporary criminal justice system. And the ideas in this school of thought trace their provenance to a philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes is one of the most important philosophers you may have never heard of. And Hobbes was writing at a time when large cities in Europe were just about to appear. Paris, London were just becoming very large, and people were moving from the countryside to the newly industrializing urban areas. And in the countryside, in the villages, order had always been maintained through tradition and through kinship ties, and the villages were very homogeneous, and so order was sort of built into the village. But Hobbes and other philosophers wondered how order could be possible in the city, because there were no shared traditions, because people were strangers to one another. And so the problem of how the state can function, how the state can exist, how people who don't know one another can exist in a more or less harmonious state, was something that these what are called social contract philosophers began to think about. And Hobbes' book on this is called Leviathan, and it is a classic in philosophy. And what Hobbes believed is that by their nature, in their feral state, human beings are hedonistic and depraved, completely selfish. That human beings will always act in their own self-interest, unless they are restrained. And left to their own devices, society would be a war of all against all, and social life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Left in our feral state, we would destroy ourselves in our greed. Now, in times past, kinship bonds and tradition had restrained human nature, but what restrains us now in the city? And what Hobbes argued is that people in urban areas, people in modern states, and he called the state the Leviathan, people in the Leviathan make a sort of uncontracted contract where they say, okay, we are willing to submit to laws in order to survive. We're willing to give up some of our freedom so that we can be safe. Okay? So that's an odd idea. For Hobbes, the opposite of freedom is safety. Now, when you think about the opposite of freedom, you might think that bondage is the opposite of freedom, but that's not the way that Hobbes looked at it. He argued you can either be free, that is, you can pursue your own hedonistic pursuits, or you can be safe. So now think about this. Would you like to live in a society that's totally free? What would a society be like that's totally free? What if there were no laws on campus about where you could park? You could just pull your car up wherever you wanted. You just park right next to the building. You know, at first glance, that might be nice, but you probably wouldn't be able to get up next to the building because somebody would already be there, or there'd be cars strewn all over the place with people parking wherever they could put their car. Sometimes you might want to go faster. Sometimes you might want to go through a red light, but I'll bet you're glad there are speed limits. I'll bet you're glad there are traffic laws, because it would be chaos without them. What if I could just steal anything I want? Well, might be nice for me, but if I can steal anything I want, anybody else can steal anything they want. So you can see what Hobbes is saying is that we all agree that our freedom needs to be curtailed. And for Hobbes, safety is the opposite of freedom. But, nobody wants to live in a society that's totally safe either. What would a society that's totally safe be like? What if I am worried about crimes being committed on the internet? So we give the police complete access to your computer at all times, and that the police can inspect all of your emails, and the pictures of your family vacation that you send to your mom are subject to scrutiny by the government, and love letters you might send to your significant other can be read by the internet police. Or assume that the state can enter your house at any time for any reason to go through your things. Or imagine that we decide we're going to have a midnight curfew, and no one can be out on the street after midnight without a card to identify themselves, and they have to have business out after that time, or they're subject to arrest. Like, there are all kinds of things we could do that would be powerful deterrents to crime. It would make society safe, but we don't want to live in a totalitarian state. When China, the United States has pushed China for a long time to liberalize and to recognize individual freedoms. And, one of the reasons why the Chinese have balked at this is because they don't want to have the kind of crime rates that we have. Right? The freedom that allows you to go to the ATM at 2:00 in the morning to withdraw some money is the same freedom that might allow me to hide in the bushes, to rob you when you leave the ATM. If neither one of us has any kind of criminal record, if neither one of us has done anything wrong to that point, there's no way you could impose a curfew on one without imposing a curfew on the other, or leave one free without leaving the other free. So we want to have some freedom. We want to have some safety. So how do we stop relatively free people from committing criminal acts? This leads us to a guy by the name of Cesar Beccaria, who, along with Lombroso, is considered to be one of the founders of modern criminology. And Beccaria's essay was called On Crimes and Punishments. You can see it there in the original Italian. And what Beccaria argued is that humans operate on the pleasure principle, that whenever human beings approach any kind of activity, their brains are rational, calculating engines, and they attempt to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So when you're thinking about doing something, you weigh the costs against the benefits. And as far as Beccaria is concerned, the reason why some people commit crimes is because the pleasure of committing crime outweighs the pain. And this is a philosophy that is known as utilitarianism. So the calculus is benefits minus cost equal action. With respect to crime, if there is more perceived benefit than there is cost, then crime occurs. If there's less perceived benefit than cost, then there is no crime. Now, what are the benefits of crime? It's pretty easy to see what the benefits are. The benefits of stealing things are that I get stuff without having to pay for it. And what are the costs? Well, if the person who owns the material catches me stealing from them, there could be big problems. Right? So, as far as Beccaria is concerned, if you want to prevent crime, then the pain of crime has to outweigh the pleasure. That's how you solve the crime problem. And of course, you do that with punishment. Punishment is the cost. And according to Beccaria, effective punishment has three characteristics. Now, he used a little bit different words for these, but I'll use the words that sort of correspond with what we mean in society today. First, he argues that punishment has to be swift. It has to be closely associated with the act. Right? When you're training a dog, if you want the dog to refrain from doing something, or you want the dog to do something, the reward or the punishment has to come right after the act. Otherwise, the dog won't associate the punishment with the act. And Beccaria says humans are the same way. Punishment has to be closely associated with the act, swift. Number two, punishment has to be certain. That is to say, the punishment has to be an inevitable consequence of the act. You do the crime, you will do the time. So the person who is committing the criminal act has to be able to expect that the punishment is coming. And the last thing is the punishment needs to be proportionate. Now, he used different words, but what is meant by the words that he used is what I would call proportionate. You've heard the saying, let the punishment fit the crime. And that's what this means, that you need to make sure that the costs or the punishment outweighs the benefits, but you can't have things too imbalanced. If the punishment is too light, then the benefits will exceed the cost. If the punishment is too severe, then ironically, you can have problems or more crime can be created. So for example, let's say there's a rash of burglaries in our town. And I say, look, these burglaries are intolerable. I'm going to put a stop to them. And so from now on, death penalty for burglary. Now, you might think that the death penalty for burglary is going to stop all the burglaries, but it probably wouldn't. Some people would probably still burglarize. And if the penalty for burglary is death, and I burglarized a house and I accidentally found that the people were home, somebody saw me, what would a rational burglar do? Well, Beccaria would say the rational burglar would kill the inhabitants, because the penalty for murder is death. The penalty for burglary is death. Best not to leave any witnesses. So the punishment for burglary shouldn't be the same as the punishment for murder. Punishments have to fit the crime. So these are the three elements of useful punishment. Punishment has to be swift and certain and proportionate. Now, when you hear this, you say to yourself, well, that's no duh. I mean, that seems pretty obvious. But in his day, Beccaria was a reformer. In his day, the prevailing view was that criminals were possessed by the devil. That's why they committed crime. That they were, had demons inside them. Now, think about what crime policy would be like if we thought that crime was committed by demons. And what happened in Beccaria's day is often people that were accused of crime were tortured in order to extract a confession. And the idea was that if a person is guilty, they will confess. And if they're innocent, then God will give them strength to endure the torture. And Beccaria said that this is a crappy idea because it allows the robust scoundrel to go free, and it causes the weak to be convicted. In colonial America, people who were accused of crimes or witchcraft were put on the ducking stool, which was essentially a seesaw that people were put on and dipped into a river and held underwater. And the idea is that if they came up dead, then they were innocent of the crime which they were accused of. And if they came up alive, like no one that wasn't possessed by a demon could ever hold their breath that long. They must be bewitched, so burn them at the stake. And you can see that's a pretty primitive, barbaric criminal justice system. So this idea of deterring people with punishment, and Beccaria's ideas are at the roots of what we call deterrence theory, is an advance. Okay, so based on this theory, how do we deal with the crime problem? Well, we either lower the perceived benefits of crime or we raise the perceived costs. Now, there are ways to sort of lower the perceived benefits of crime. Have you ever gone to the store and bought an article of clothing and it has this sort of dye, that sort of capsule with dye that's attached to the clothing that can't be removed unless the cashier uses a particular tool to take it off the clothes? I mean, you can steal it, but it won't do you any good because you can't get that off without the tool. I mean, if you pried it off with tools around your house, it would just spill dye all over the clothes and ruin the clothes. So even though the clothes aren't harder to steal, it's just as easy to stuff them in your pants or to put them in a backpack or whatever and walk out of the store with them. They're no good to you unless you've paid for them and had the cashier remove the dye bomb. So that's one way to lower perceived benefits. There are also ways to raise costs that aren't associated with punishment. Right? Electronic surveillance. You might be inclined to commit a crime, but then you see cameras everywhere, and so you don't do it because you know you're going to be on camera. So this is the idea behind deterrence. But sometimes there are very interesting side effects that take place. So, for instance, think about a burglary. Think about burglary as a public problem. When I was a kid, my parents never locked the front door. They just left the door open. There was no such thing as a neighborhood watch when I was a kid. There's a lot better lighting on the streets now than there used to be. There's a public effort now when you're on vacation to have somebody get your mail. Back in the old days, almost everybody subscribed to the newspaper. So if you saw newspapers stacking up on someone's porch, you knew they weren't home, and that would make the car ripe for a burglary. And so what ended up happening is people took steps to make their house harder to burglarize. But an interesting thing happened. As the burglary rate fell, the robbery rate started to rise. Because if you think about it, what is the motivation to burglarize? It's to steal stuff. And what is the motivation to rob? Well, it's to steal stuff too, but it's to steal stuff with the violence or the threat of violence. Now, I would much rather break into your house while you're not home and steal your stuff, but you've made your house so much harder to break into now than it was a generation ago with your alarm and your electronic surveillance. So would-be burglars that are still motivated to steal end up pushed into the street. My wife is from Puerto Rico, and one of the things that you'll see when you go to Puerto Rico is everybody's home is a fortress. They're iron, even working class people have iron bars on every window and iron bars on the door. The houses are literally a fortress. And why are the houses a fortress? Because people perceive that the streets are incredibly dangerous. Well, one of the reasons the streets are dangerous is because the houses are impossible to burglarize. Anybody that's motivated to steal is going to have to steal it off your person because they're not going to break into the house. So the irony here is that by making homes harder to burglarize, you increase the robbery rate. One thing that we see is that drugs are pretty much fungible. That as we crack down on one drug, another pops up. And, when I was in college, cocaine and crack were all the rage, and everybody was using them, and all the interdiction efforts went into cocaine and crack, and now opioids are all the rage, and everybody is using opioids, and that's the big drug problem. If we crack down on opioids, it'll probably be something else. So this is the idea of crime displacement, sort of push down pop-up theory of crime. Sometimes when you raise the stakes in one area, things will go up in another area. So that's one of the problems with this idea of cost-benefit analysis. Another problem is pretty obvious. Punishment has to conform to these characteristics: swift, certain, and proportionate. So let's take these in turn. Is justice in the United States swift? No, it is not swift. If you are arrested for a felony tomorrow and you go to trial, it's highly doubtful that you will see the inside of a courtroom for a trial within a year, or even within 18 months. It could be 2 years before you end up with the trial. Is punishment in the United States certain? Again, no. Think about robberies and burglaries that we've been talking about. Only 27% of robberies are cleared by arrest. That means 3/4 of robberies, no one even gets arrested. For burglary, only 14% of burglaries are cleared by arrest. And so this is a problem. There is no swiftness. There is no certainty. And so what we've done is made the mistake that because there's no swiftness and because there's no certainty, we've blown it on the proportionate part too. And what we've done is, rather than be proportionate, we've tried to be severe. So we make the punishment so severe that no one will dare commit the crime. But as we'll see, making things more severe has diminishing returns. So look at this graph here. And you can see on the vertical axis, we have a depiction of the crime rate from low crime to high crime. And on the horizontal axis, we have a depiction of punishment from light punishment to severe punishment. And let's say that the punishment that we have, I'd say I'm the king of Jacksonville and I can control punishments for crime. And the punishment that we have for burglary is, 1 year in jail. And look at all these burglaries we still have with 1 year in jail. We're having a rash of burglaries. And so what I'm going to do is double the time in jail from 1 year to 2 years in jail. And you can see if 1 year in jail is the far left bar, the next bar over, you see a pretty substantial reduction in crime. The doubling of the sentence makes a lot of people think twice. People who are like, well, a year in jail, but there could be good stuff in that house, so I'm going to rob it. 2 years in jail, If we then increase, because some people are still going to probably burglarize, even if the punishment is 2 years in jail. If we then increase it from 2 years to 5 years, we see another reduction in crime. And if we drop it from 5 years to 10 years, we get an even another reduction in crime. But as you can see, that as the punishment gets more and more severe, you get diminishing returns. The red line is a sort of linear line that our system theorizes, that as punishments get more and more severe, if you just crank up the punishment into perpetuity, as far as it will go, crime will eventually go down to zero. But that's not how it works. In our country, we attempt to compensate for the fact that punishment is not certain by making it severe. And that just isn't how Beccaria's calculus works. Because at a certain point, criminals aren't saying, oh, it's worth it. It's worth the risk to spend 10 years in jail to burglarize that house. Even if I get caught, what I get in that house is worth 10 years in prison. No. What they're saying is they don't think they're going to get caught, regardless of what the punishment is. They don't think they're going to get caught. And so because they're not going to be, they don't think they're going to be caught, they can't be deterred. Right? What possible deterrent effect would going from 20 years in prison to 30 years in prison have? If I told you I was going to pick you up right now and put you in jail for 20 years, but the good news is you'll be compensated. Like, how much money do I have to give you before you go to jail for 20 years? Almost everybody would say no amount of money. There's not that you couldn't give me enough money for me to go to prison and sacrifice 20 years of my life for some sum of money. Well, you're never going to burglarize a house or an establishment and get enough money to make it worth it so that you would be in prison saying, yeah, that was a good idea. You're saying, I don't think I'm going to get caught. So what we're doing is putting people in prison for incredibly long periods of time in the vain hope that these long sentences will lower the crime rate. And there isn't any data to suggest that that's going to happen. There are some other problems with this theory as well. One problem is that criminals need to know the law in order to be deterred. Do you know what the criminal punishment is actually for burglary? I don't. Do you know what the punishment is for possession of LSD? What the punishment is for auto theft? Like, I can make some educated guesses, but I really don't know what the actual punishments are. And if I don't know, I'm sure some 19-year-old boy who is committing these crimes doesn't know. So if you don't know the punishment, how can you be deterred? Right? The other thing is that this idea that humans are rational, calculating engines, that we weigh costs and benefits, that's just not the way that people behave. I don't think that people do always weigh costs and benefits, right? Anybody in this country that's 5 years old or older knows that smoking is bad for you. But people start smoking all the time because they don't know? No, because people behave in ways that are not rational. I see people who say to me all the time things like, "Oh, this person is so bad for me. I can't believe I'm in a relationship with them. They hurt my life. They hurt me. They're bad for me. They make me cry. They're no good for me." And yet I stay with them. Well, why do people stay with someone who's bad for them? Because love is not rational. People don't behave necessarily in rational ways. So, if criminals are thinking about what they're going to get and they're emphasizing the benefit part and they're not thinking about the cost part, well, then they're not going to be deterred. Another thing is, we're very, very lucky that people don't simply approach the decision to commit crime on the basis of costs and benefits. Because if they did, there would be a lot more crime. Haven't you ever been in a store where, say, the merchant goes in the back room and, you think, yeah, I could rob this place blind. Haven't you ever had an opportunity to steal something, but you didn't? I remember one time I was at the airport and a guy was, fiddling with his suitcase and something happened and he walked off and left his laptop sitting on a table, and it just sat there, and it took him like 10 minutes to realize he'd left his laptop. I could have easily closed that laptop and took it. There would have been great benefit to me, would have got me a new laptop at no cost. I don't think anybody would have seen it. I don't steal. You don't steal because you're worried about getting caught. Hopefully you don't steal because your mom taught you that stealing is wrong. And when people have a sense of morality and they've internalized morals, that's the reason why they're not going to steal. If the only reason you didn't, say, cheat on your spouse is that you're worried that you're going to get caught, well, then you're a pretty crappy spouse. If the only reason you don't steal is that you're worried you're going to get caught, well, then you're going to be a huge thief because you're going to have lots of chances to steal without getting caught. So this theory discounts the fact that some people are properly socialized and they're morally restrained from crime. Okay? So this is the classical theory. This is the theory that our present system of justice operates on. And it's a theory that most sociologists think has a kernel of truth. There is some deterrence. There does have to be costs of crime. But it probably doesn't explain crime as good as the public thinks it does. And there are many more problems with the theory than the criminal justice system recognizes.